This is English version of this podcast. To jest angielska wersja tego podcastu. If you want to listen in Polish, download the other one. Jeśli chcecie posłuchać po polsku, ściągnijcie tą drugą wersję.
Hello, you're logging into the new chapter of Leftist Drivel.
Hello, you're listening to the new chapter of Lewackie Pitolenie. My guest today is using the name MizLiot, and I found her on Twitter when she is demonstrating extreme patience explaining the matters of the Scots language to ignorant people. Hello.
Hi, I like it, ignorant people.
Yeah, I'm telling about this recurring thing on your Twitter when you set them straight by giving them like official data from linguists and specialists and sending them to do some research, which I doubt they ever do. But that prompted me to invite you for this podcast and for that discussion, because especially in Poland, but also in Britain, people don't know that there are three languages in Scotland. Some people do know that there's Scottish Gaelic, but Scots is something that it's really not known. So can you explain to us what Scots is?
Okay, so Scots is a member of the Germanic language family. It's related to English and shares a lot of similarities with English, which is why they're called sister languages. And you see this in other language families as well. So because of their similarity, people don't always realise they're actually different languages, especially because in Scotland, till fairly recently, we never received formal education in the language itself.
Okay, but is that language widely used, or is just some exotic leftover of the olden times, like say the Norse in the north? Because there's also the Norse, which is really not widely used anymore, but that was yet another language used on the Scottish.
It does have some Nordic influence, mainly in the north parts of Scotland and, the islands.
Yeah, but I meant, like, is it widely used, or it's just...
Yeah, It's used by 1.5 million people in Scotland, which is approximately 30% of the population. But everybody also speaks English. So a lot of the time, like I said, because we lack the formal education, people who are speaking Scots might actually think they're speaking English. So it's quite possible that the number of speakers of Scots is much higher than we know it is from the census, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see that. And I think for people like me, it will be also hard to distinguish them for other reasons, because I used to live in Glasgow for 17 years and I worked with working class people, and I had some work colleagues that I was barely able to understand when they were talking to me, even after 50 years in Scotland. But the question is if they were speaking to me with like very strong Glasgow accent and slang, or if they were speaking Scots to me. I couldn't say that. How intermixed those two are.
They might well have been speaking standard Scottish English to you, which is English spoken with a Scottish accent, and it's kind of on a spectrum where Scots is at the other end and completely, different to English. Well, completely different to Scottish Standard English anyway. Glaswegian people do speak Scots and they do also speak English, so because of the way our education system works and the way our society is, they may very well have been speaking a mixture of both languages to you at any one time. And also they do have an accent which is quite strong, which is not a bad thing, of course.
Yeah, so if someone wants to see how Scots sons will say Borniston TV show be good for them, or that's nothing to do with Scots, that's just Glasgow?
I've never watched Burniston.
Okay,
I'm
then
sorry.
let's leave it as that. Yeah, because it is a funny sketch show with the famous sketch with the elevator.
Yeah,
Maybe
I've seen
that
it.
one, yeah.
I've seen the elevator sketch. I think everybody has. I haven't watched the programme itself. The elevator focuses more on the accent rather than language, I think. Something good to watch for Scots language. I think still Game, the first couple of series uses a lot more kind of Scots in it than it does later on when the BBC took it up and broadcast it to the rest of the UK. There's a bit of Scots in it. But as you'll have seen yourself, a lot of media in Scotland tends to be in English or in Gaelic.
Which brings me to another question, that Gaelic is mostly contained to like Western Scotland, Outer Hebrides especially, but it's getting revival in the Central Belt as well. In Glasgow, there are several schools when you can send your kids to learn in Gaelic. Is it safe to say that Gaelic was the language of the Northwest and Scots was the language of the Lowlands?
At one time, Gaelic was actually spoken across Scotland. There's this misconception that Gaelic was only really contained to one section of Scotland or one large area of it, when it's been around for a long time. It was kind of here before Scots as well, before Scots became widely spoken, and it was the main language at one point, and there's evidence of it in the borders of Scotland as well. It has receded, partly through the rise of Scots and then the rise of English and then active education policies to prevent Gaelic speakers from using it in schools. But there's also a resurgent group in Edinburgh as well called Bohan Dunedin, which is a Gaelic group that meets up every month. So there are people in Edinburgh who speak Gaelic as well. And you're right, in Glasgow, it's got quite a lot of speakers. There's organisations there that are focused on Gaelic, like An Lochran, which is a Gaelic charity shop that's in Glasgow.
There's also an institute on the Glasgow University where they study Gaelic, so that's also the case.
Yeah, there's a lot going for it at the moment.
And how's with Scots? Because I can think of several media that is broadcasting or writing in Gaelic. I can see all these bilingual road signs with Gaelic and English. But when it comes to Scots, I think this Bella Caledonian portal is the only one I can think of that publishes in Scots.
The Scots Language Centre also publishes poetry and blog posts in Scots and about Scots. The Scots Language Centre, I would say, is kind of the main body dealing with the Scots language at the moment. But the reason why we have Gaelic on our road signs and not Scots, and why we've got Gaelic medium education, which is, the schools that teach entirely in Gaelic with bits of English, is because of laws that have been passed to protect the Gaelic language that Scots doesn't yet have. But the Scottish Government did a consultation late last year looking at the status of the Scots language and Gaelic to see what could be done to further the language. So it'll be interesting to see what the result of that consultation is and whether or not it means that Scots will be more included in education than it already is, and whether it'll be included on road signs, that sort of thing.
I find it interesting because from what you said and from what I know of the Gaelic, it's at least 10 times more speakers of Scots than Gaelic. So on one hand, you can expect that government would do more. On the other hand, I can understand why they had to spend so many resources to try to save Gaelic from extinction. So
yes, both languages are equally worthy of preservation and support going forward for the speakers. I think it does come back to a lot of the attitudes around Scots and Gaelic are slightly different in that even people who don't see the usefulness of Gaelic recognise that it's a completely different language. They can't understand it when they're English speakers. But Scots' legitimacy has been undermined because of its similarity to the English language. And because not everybody is a trained linguist, and I'm including myself in that, lots of people don't understand that you can have languages that are similar to each other but still separate. So there's that kind of, lack of knowledge on what makes language that leads to Scots not being recognised properly.
Yeah, I'm finding similarities here with the Silesian language, which, if you don't know, this is like area like spanning across mostly Poland and a bit into Czech Republic as well. And, well, historically also in Germany, but now it's like cultural Silesia is mostly around the Upper Silesia, which is like Katowice and south from Katowice. And they have this Silesian language, which is also struggling to get proper recognition, because people say that, oh, this is not really a language, it's just a Polish language spoiled with some German and Czech words, and it's at best dialect. And when I listen to that, I see very big similarities to the Scots language debate in Scotland,
Yeah.
but also in that the Silesian language is often associated with the separatist movements, which are not really that strong in Silesia, although they would like to have some bit of autonomy. Of course, that's the much bigger scale of debate in Scotland, but this is another similarity. I'm finding that the issue of the Scots language is strongly politicized. From what I've seen, like people who attack you on Twitter for speaking Scots are mostly like right-wing pro-union people from England or stuff like that. Is that something you feel as well, that this promotion of Scots language is tied to Scottish independence? And I'm not saying in your private case, just in general.
In general, that's a really good question. I think largely it's been connected to Scottish independence by British Unionists, because 30 years ago this year, the Conservative Party, which are right-wing, pro-British, under John Major, set up the Scots Language Centre, which is obviously, like I'd already said, the main body promoting and advocating for the Scots language. The Labour Party, although slightly left-wing, they're also pro-Britain. They, through the Council of Europe, had Scots recognised as a minority language about 20 years ago, but nowadays, a lot of British Unionists seem to think that any expression of Scottish culture or Scottish identity means that you must be pro-independence, when that's not necessarily the case. You can, I think, embrace Scottish culture as a British Unionist. I don't think the two have to be completely mutually exclusive. But the issue is, anybody who is promoting Scots gets attacked with that, and, are just by dint of being in favour of the Scots language, they're automatically seen as being pro-independence, when sometimes there's no evidence that they are.
I also find similarities here with Russian attitudes towards Ukraine, when we can hear all this Russian propaganda saying like Ukraine is not the real language, it's just some retarded version of Russians, and Ukrainian culture is just some backward water version of Russian culture. And I feel the same notes are being used by this colonialist mindset from England towards Scotland and from Russia towards Ukraine.
I would say it's mainly actually fellow Scottish people that are displaying this attitude. It's hard to explain, but they've kind of got this mentality built into them, like some people feel about. There will even be Ukrainian people from before the war who will have felt that Ukrainian language was just a bad dialect of Russian. This attitude repeats itself the world over in different cultures, different languages, because human nature ultimately is the same. If you want to belong to something that you think is bigger than yourself, so, for example, a Scottish person who wants to be part of the UK, I think people of that nationality are more likely to... I'm trying to think how to explain it. I think, for example, Scottish people who are British Unionists are more fervent in their unionism than an English person is. An English person or a Welsh person or even somebody from Northern Ireland doesn't particularly care about the use of the Scots language in Scotland, but Scottish people who are British Unionists really care about it, because they feel it's an attack on their identity.
Yeah, I think like English people, they are not really concerned with Scotland at all. The things that always does my head is that they claim, oh, we are the one country. But if you ask them where North East is, they never say like Wick or Fraserburgh. They always say it's Newcastle.
Exactly.
Or this is funny to me. But this aggressive attitude sometimes gets like extreme forms. Like you, for example, you don't want to use your real name because of the abuse you're getting online, and then there is this famous girl, Lenny, who is a poet, and she's doing this Scots word of the day,
Yeah, she's
and she
amazing.
got so much abuse online, and I wonder, is that just coming from the keyboard warriors, or when you speak Scots on the bus, you can be met with some aggression as well?
I have been met with hostility in public for speaking Scots. It's not necessarily overt hostility where I'm being threatened, but I have people who try to change the way I'm speaking. So, for example, I went into my baker's a while back and I asked her, and I knew she was Scottish, I asked her for twa, which is two,
Mm-hmm.
twa of they cakes. So I was saying two of those cakes and I was pointing at them and she went, sorry, what? And I said, twa of they cakes. She went, oh, you want two of those cakes? And I said,
Mm-hmm.
yes, twa. And then I asked her for a poke, which means bag. And she went, a poke. And I went, yes, a poke. And she went, you mean a bag? And I went, I mean a poke. Do you see? This sort of thing happens a lot where people feel the need to, and I'm air quoting here, correct Scots speakers out of their Scots and into English, which, whilst not being overtly hostile to the language, is kind of passive aggressive because it's giving you the message that the way you're speaking is wrong when it's perfectly correct to speak like that in Scots. This is something that repeats all the way back to childhood. From when we're children, adults around us are trying to stop us from using Scots.
Yeah, although, like, to play devil's advocate here, I asked that several times to this colleague of mine who spoke this probably Scots language to me because, as this is not the language I'm so familiar with, I had to make sure that I do understand him. So maybe it's not always coming from the hostility. I always recall when I had this stand during my studies when I was riding buses and doing some statistics on passengers. I've been spending all days riding the bus up and down. And I've noticed that many Scottish people, when they enter the bus and they ask the driver something, they cannot understand each other because of different accents, and as we know now, probably before because of the different languages as well. So maybe in some cases it's just genuine attempts to understand if they understood you well.
You're right. There are going to be people who don't understand Scots in Scotland, even amongst other Scottish people. But I do live in an area that is quite strongly Scots speaking.
Can you tell us roughly, at least, where it is?
Fife. Fife has got quite a lot of Scots speakers because I hear them every day when I'm out and about. I hear people talking in Scots all the time, but they would probably tell you that they're speaking English.
Because they may just don't know that,
Yeah.
that the words are coming. Yeah.
But the point was that I've heard this, because I go into this baker's quite frequently, I've heard this girl speak before, so I know she actually can understand a Scots speaker. So otherwise I wouldn't have used her as an example.
Yeah, I see that. I was just thinking in general, not according to her, that it may be. But other thing that comes to mind, it is said sometimes that Scots is the language of uneducated people, like lower working classes and so on, which again is very often this colonialist attitude when like the elites of the country are supposed to speak the proper language and just the pleb speaks this retarded version of whatever language they consider to be the true language. Is that the case in Scotland as well? Is Scots the working class language, or it's just because of the lack of education in this language in general that it remains in certain groups of the community?
I think by and large it is spoken mainly by working class people from my experience. I've met people in the middle classes. They tend to use a smattering of Scots occasionally. Like, they use words that are Scots without realising it. For example, out with, which doesn't exist in the English language. It's hard to explain. The upper classes don't really use Scots at all, although apparently the late Queen was able to speak Doric, which is a dialect of the Scots.
Yeah, I've heard that. So this really drives mad some of those anti-Scots people when they hear that Queen was speaking and valuing that language.
Yeah, I think a lot of it again comes down to the Scots language is an oral language in terms of most people learn it from being spoken to in it. So it's really passed down through word of mouth rather than English, which, whilst we do learn through word of mouth, is we also learn it at school, whereas Scots hasn't really been taught at school. So I think largely working class people would have been speaking Scots more often to their children than middle or upper classes, and that's also because of this attitude of you'll never get anywhere in your life if you speak Scots.
Yeah, I guess so. But you touched something I wanted to come back later. But as we already at this topic, let's go this route. Written Scots, because as you said, there's like no formal education of it, and I guess there are no standards. I tried to learn Gaelic when I lived in Scotland. I hadn't had much of success because the pronunciation of the when you try to read is just the most crazy language I ever tried, and I'm learning Finnish now, so that's
Well,
something.
Good luck.
And the lady who was teaching us Gaelic, she said that with this revival of Gaelic, they had to do some standardization because before that, like every island had a slightly different dialect.
Yeah.
And with like emergence of BBC Alba and BBC Gael radio station, they had to settle down on some common version for everyone, which like brings everyone together, but also is responsible for these local variations to disappear because everyone suddenly starts speaking, let's just say, the Queen's Gaelic. And when it comes to Scots, it also seems to me that there are no written rules. So when you look at Twitter, when someone is trying to write in Scots, sometimes really it seems to me like an ignorant person that it's someone is trying to like write some English words phonetically or something like that. Are there any standards of spelling in written Scots, or it's still something that needs to be done?
Scots hasn't got standardised spelling yet. It does have accepted spellings, so when you're reading through the dictionary of the Scots language, it'll give you a word and it will then also give you the multiple spellings that are generally accepted. And the reason why they have this is because Scots, as it is spoken in different areas of Scotland, can be so different that the way a word sounds to me, or the way I use a word, is different to somebody who is speaking Doric. So they have a different spelling of the same word. I can't think of any examples right now, which off the top of my head, because I'm absolutely terrible for that sort of on the spot thinking.
Yeah, but if they go on your Twitter, they can find some of your tweets that are written in Scots. And I have to say, like, after all those years in Scotland, I would probably have no problem understanding you when you spoke some of those sentences to me. But I really need to focus to see what do you mean if you write.
Yeah, you're right, because it is a language that you're not used to seeing written down unless you're reading Robert Burns's poetry or that sort of thing. If you're not really big into Scots literature, you're hardly going to see it except on Twitter nowadays.
And like some of those portals we mentioned before.
Yeah, there is an argument for standardising the Scots language that a lot of people are kind of putting forward. Going forward, the idea that Scots will need to be standardised like other languages. English was itself only standardised about 250 years ago, so it's not really been that long. But we do have our own grammatical rules anyway that we follow.
And coming back to this other aspect you mentioned before, like mixing English and Scots, can you think of any Scots words that came to English and are widely used, at least in Scotland? Because, as I said, I'm ignorant in this subject, but I love that in Scotland you use some things that are not available in like standard British English. For example, I, as a Slavic speaker originally, I always was desperate that you don't have distinguish between a singular and plural you. And then when I discovered yes, the Scottish plural you, I just so loved it, and I'm using that very often. So are there any examples like that of the words that are from Scots and are widely used in English, at least in Scotland?
Yeah, wow. The word wow. W-O-W.
Uh-huh.
That's Scots.
That's like exclamation, yeah?
Yeah, wow. That's
Mhm.
Scots. That's the Scots word. That's moved into English and it's become used the world over.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I would never even think that it's coming from Scots. Yeah.
As far as I'm aware, I could be completely wrong, but that's what I've read.
And then, if you are okay with that, I would also like to touch some of the politics, because as you said, the Scots was recognized by the actions of the British government in
Yes.
Westminster. Those like 20 something years ago. Now the attitude down there are probably at least they lost interest in that, and now it's being promoted by the Scottish government.
Yes.
Which brings me to the question. I know you said there is not like one-to-one correlation between like willing Scottish independence and being promoter of the Scottish local languages,
Mhm.
but I think it cannot be ignored, because what Polish people don't know, like, the very common mistake still is thinking about Britain as England, which is not only thing for the Polish people, but Scotland is very significantly different culturally to England, from what I think. I'm not only saying about those like languages issues and stuff, because of course there are some other languages in the south too, like there's a Welsh and Cornish, but there's also a big cultural difference. I find in general, of course, there are generalization, and you never should do that, but still, Scottish people to be much more open-minded, much more friendly towards foreigners, and this is what sets them apart. And some people say like Scotland got a bit of this Nordic feel, and I wonder if that's can be historically true, because also if you look at the flags, you got like Orkney flag, Shetland flag, or Saltuse or Sky flag. They all have, or Bara, they all have this Nordic crosses and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say they particularly were influenced by Nordic countries. Mainland Scotland, now not so much.
Yeah, but still there is this difference of cultures between Poland, between England and Scotland. And I got this private theory. I wonder if you agree with me that this is because when English people were going somewhere, they were usually going as conquerors, colonizers, and that puts you into certain mindset. While many Scottish people were going abroad just like Poles, because they were seeking better life, they were like emigrating for better jobs. There was even a law in Poland a couple of 100 years ago that if you were Scottish, you weren't allowed off the ship in Gdańsk until you showed that you got enough money to survive, because of this bloody Scottish people coming there and stealing our jobs. I'm perfectly serious. This is a historic fact.
I've just
And
never heard it. That's amazing.
yeah, there was a big migrations of Scots to Poland in the like 1600s, I think. And even a mayor of Warsaw was a Scottish guy for some period of time. And the king had like a Scottish regiment of Scottish mercenaries. And because they proved them worthy in the battle, then he gave them lands to settle. And if you look at the map of Poland, and you use various variations of the word Scotland or Scottish people, you will find several villages which refer with the names to Scotland, because that was where the Scottish people were settling.
Yes.
And I think this is in a large part responsible for this different mindset and openness to other nations. Do you think that's theory can be valid, or it's just me making up shit?
I don't think you're making up shit. Pardon my language. It's true that the Scots have a large diaspora of people that emigrated out to different places all across the world. There was like a Scottish bit of Siberia at one point, and there was apparently a Hawaiian princess who was also partly Scottish. What I would say though is in regards to the subject of the English being colonisers and the Scots not being colonisers, this isn't strictly true. As part of the British Empire.
I do know that, but I mean, like, for the more common people, because of course Scotland was a part of the colonizing power as well, and we can go into the history why it's even led to Scotland being controlled by England after this failed attempts to create their own colonies.
Yeah, the only reason I'm mentioning that Scotland has a part to play in British colonialism is because we have such a blank on it in our education. A lot of people kind of cringe away from the idea that we actively participated in colonisation. And I feel it's important to acknowledge that we did. Like, for example, Jamaica, there's people with Scottish surnames.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that those, that they're descended from slavers or people who worked on plantations. Robert Burns himself was planning to go out to Jamaica to work on a plantation, but he wouldn't have been the slave owner. He would have been a kind of slave driver, but he didn't in the end. But, the reason why I'm making it very clear that we were active in colonization is I don't want to shy away from our history, and Scotland traditionally, up until about 40 years ago, was very conservative itself. I mean, we last voted the Conservative Party in 1955, I want to say. But yes, Scotland isn't completely the left-wing utopia that we would all like it to be. There are a lot of conservative elements, as we've seen kind of recently with gender reform, the people reacting to that. Some of them have
Scottish Family Party and stuff.
Yes,
like that.
Exactly. We've got our own kind of right-wing nut jobs. Pardon my language.
Yeah, but I think they are everywhere. They are all over Scandinavia as well. So
yeah,
so it's nothing unusual.
No, but generally speaking, you're right in that we are very welcoming to people who aren't originally from Scotland and who move to Scotland and become new Scots if they want to consider themselves that. But I also think it's important to acknowledge that there are people who are less friendly, and it's the same for England. There's people in England who are amazing with people who don't come from England, but there are always going to be people who aren't, unfortunately.
That's true. But I think it also goes back in the history. You mentioned Robert Burns, and I remember being surprised finding that in one of his poems he was talking about Poland suffering under Russian occupation and so on. And it's not often you see in Britain like the national poets and writers being focused on some Eastern European country's fate. So I was really surprised to find that at Robert Burns' poetry.
I think there was a lot of kind of sense of kinship, particularly towards Polish people back then, and also Bonnie Prince Charles Edward Stuart, he married a Polish princess, Marie Sobieska.
That's true, yeah.
So I think we don't realise that people, like, different countries from different ends of Europe back then were really still communicating with each other. We kind of have this east-west idea in our heads, and that they were always completely separate and not communicating with each other, but that's not true either.
Yeah, I wonder if that could be also because as there was this big wave of migration from Scotland to Poland until the partitions, at least, so maybe there was still a strong Scottish community in Poland, and that's how the connections remained.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, I also found fascinating that if you look at these historical sources for the Scottish community in Poland, they got this kind of like Scottish association in Poland. And what fascinates me is that it was something completely different to this like expat attitude you get from all the British people who moved to Poland now, because they were careful enough to keep all their documents and bookings, even related to purely Scottish matters.
Oh.
They are written in Polish. And that's what I find fascinating. So
it sounds like they really acclimatise, and that's good.
Yeah, as I said, there was this guy, Alexander Chalmer, but I think he was Chalmers or something, and his surname was Polonized, and he was mayor of Warsaw at least twice, and he's really renowned for his good politics, and I think he was also dealing well with some plague. So the Polish history owes a lot to Scottish people. Okay, but coming back to Robert Burns.
No.
I'm not going to beat into literature. I wanted just to ask you one thing, because 25th of January is coming.
Yeah.
What's the deal with Burns Night?
It's to celebrate his birthday.
But is it really for normal in inventor commas people? Like, do you celebrate Robert Burns' birthday unless it's some like or thing organized by the university? Like, do ordinary Scottish people sit and read the Ode to Haggis?
Yes. So certainly in my case, I always ensure that I have haggis on Burns Night. I mean, I eat haggis anyway because it's absolutely delicious for anybody who hasn't tried it. Of course, the vegetarian one is quite nice, but it's not the same. But yes, on Burns Night, I always eat haggis, and I do like to read Address To a Haggis out loud, but it usually is just kind of me and my husband and our cats at home.
I've been wondering, because like he's not the only one of famous Scottish writers.
No, he's not.
Why him?
I think Robert Burns was one of the earliest poets in Scotland to really sink not just into the national consciousness of Scotland, because obviously there are earlier poets like Dunbar and Blind Harry and Henryson, all these people who hundreds of years earlier were absolutely amazing at their craft. But I think it's because he also became super popular in England, and in the years following his death, because he died he was quite young, really, even by the standards of the time when he died. He became worldwide famous. So I think that's why he's sunk more into the national consciousness than a lot of his earlier writers.
I think we can slowly head to finish, but tell me, if you are someone who doesn't know anything about the Scots language and want to learn more after listening to our podcast today, where you would direct them?
There's a few places. First of all, the Scots Language Centre, because that gives you all the resources you need to start going, places to go. And also...
Is it online?
It is online, yeah. It's online. And also the Open University of Scotland does a free online short course in the Scots language. It is in English, so you need to have a good understanding of English to be able to do it. But they might find that interesting. And like I said, it's free to sign up. So I don't see why anybody outside of the UK couldn't sign up to it.
Cool. So thank you for letting us direction to all these sources. And I think people can find some interesting place there. I think we should mention that you yourself, you are not a linguistic expert, but you are someone who grew up speaking Scots. And that's why I would like to ask you to finish us out with reading of the most famous poem in Scots, so people who never heard this language can hear it.
Yeah. So Address to a Haggis by Robert Burns. Robert Burns being a famous Scottish poet, the bard as we call him. And Address to a Haggis is traditionally read at Burns Night on the 25th of January before the haggis is cut open and everybody gets to tuck in. Fair fa your honest sonsy face, great chieftain o' the puddin race, aboon the ma ye tak your place, painch triper therm, weel are ye wordy o' a grace as lang's my airm. The groaning trencher there ye fill, your hurdies like a distant hill, your pin wad help to mend a mill in time of need, while through your pores the dews distill like amber bead. His knife see rustic labour dight, and cut you up wi' ready slight, trenching your gushing entrails bright like honey ditch, and then, oh what a glorious sight, warm reeking, rich, then horn for horn they stretch and strive, deal tack the hindmost on they drive, till a' their wheels swelled kites belive are bent like drums, then all good men maist like to rive, but thank it hums. Is there that hour his French ragout, or olio that would still a so, or fricassee would mak her spew with perfect scorner, looks down with sneering scornful view on sic a dinner. Poor devil, see him ower his trash, as feckless as a withered rash, his spindle shank a good whip lash his knee and knit, through bloody flood or field to dash, oh how unfit. But mark the rustic, haggis fed, the trembling earth resounds his tread, clapping his wally neva blade, he'll mak it whistle, and legs and arms and heads will sned like taps of thistle. Ye powers, wha mak mankind your care, and dish them out their bill of fare. Old Scotland wants nae skinking ware that jops and luggies, but if ye wish her grateful prayer, gie her a haggis. And that's it. Did you understand any of it?
I have to say maybe 60%, which I think is not so bad.
Yeah. It's essentially a poem that, praises the haggis, how filling it is as a meal, and how poor people everywhere should be eating it for their health, essentially. And it kind of points at rich people eating fancy food that's not good for them, kind of laughing at them as well.
Yeah, which is actually another funny thing, which is completely on the different angle to what we talk about. Like the seafood, that used to be poor people's meal, and now it's something posh.
Yes.
And I wonder if haggis is going that way as well.
Yeah, maybe one day. I think a lot of people need to get over what the haggis is first before they try it. For a lot of people don't know what haggis is comprised of, and I'm not going to say. But it is a really filling dish.
I do like it, and for the Polish people listening, we have something similar, which is called kaszanka, and it is not exactly the same thing, but kaszanka is maybe kaszanka is more like black pudding because it has blood in it and everything, but it is, let's say, the same family of meals, so don't be afraid, because as I said, haggis is good. Maybe not the one you buy in the cans in the supermarket, but if you go to Scotland, definitely try it, because it is
make sure to have a beef burger with haggis as a topping as well if you can whilst you're in Scotland.
Oh yeah, but there is even a haggis pizza. I've seen that.
Yes, oh god, deep fried haggis pizza. Yeah.
Oh, deep fried. Yeah, that's another thing of the Scottish cuisine. And as we are speaking already about something that is very Scottish and strangers are afraid to try it, only after like 15 years in Scotland, I tried deep fried Mars bar, and I was surprised that it's absolutely brilliant. Nothing as bad as you could expect from the description.
It's like a heart attack waiting to happen.
Yeah. I eat only half of that together with someone else, and it's enough. But yeah.
Yeah, you couldn't eat a whole one.
Okay, so we touched on the linguistics, we touched on the cuisine, we touched on the politics. And as we are on the poetry, I was just thinking about asking you one more favor, because I got a poem that I translated into Polish, so we can do that. You read it in original, and then I read it in Polish, and that will give some of our Polish listeners also some insight. So, and it's Kathleen Jamie.
Kathleen Jamie. What's the name of the poem?
Sparing, like a question.
Oh, spearing, maybe. Spearing.
Yeah, probably. As I said, I'm terrible in pronunciation. So, yeah.
No, okay, so Binna feart, hinny. Yinde will gang together to the story label wids and lost ourselves. See, I'd rather wummel a single hour into the blue they wee flowers than live for a eternity in some cold heaven. Wees now, till I spear ye, will you hold with me.
Nie bój się, miły. Pewnego dnia wyruszymy przez zamglony las, gdzie zatracimy się brodząc w kobiercu błękitnych dzwonków. Jeśli miałabym wybór, wolałabym przez godzinę wirować w błękicie kwiecistym, niż spędzić całą wieczność w raju, gdzie tylko chłód. Pozwól mi wpierw zapytać, zostaniesz przy mnie na zawsze? So I think that's the first one for a podcast to read poetry live on it. But at least we are trying something new. I would really like to thank you for your time and wish you good luck in the promotion of the Scots language, and I hope the government actions to make it more recognized will be successful, because it is very important part of the Scottish culture, and as we just learned, also has influence of the worldwide English. So
well, thank you for having me, and going forward into 2023, let's hope we can ease up the Scots lead.
Okay, I guess I understand what you meant. Thank you.
Thank you.